Hello and welcome to the 288th consecutive presentation of Forum for a Better Understanding. It is often that we have a panel of guests, but for today's special program, we are having one single guest who came all the way from Hartford, Connecticut to be with us for this program. Each year, we celebrate the Interfaith Scholar Weekend. And this past year in February, we had the speaker, Dr. Yahya Michot, who is presently a professor of Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations at Hartford Seminary in Connecticut, to share with us insights into the topic, Islam, a religion for the 21st century. We're so glad that Dr. Michaud could be with us today, and I wonder if you'd begin, Doctor, by just telling us a little bit about your growing up, because what's so interesting about you grew up a Belgian Catholic who winds up marrying a Jewish lady who is now an esteemed, internationally respected Islamic scholar who has taught at the Louvain Catholic University, Oxford in the Great Britain, and now at the best school of all, Hartford Seminary here in our country. How did all this happen that you would become such a scholar coming from a Catholic root?
First of all, thank you for welcoming me in this program. It's a pleasure to be in this part of the US where I have never been before. And to answer your question, it's very difficult to understand sometimes the ways followed by the Lord about the destiny of one individual. I had never thought when I was a child living in a little city in the south of Belgium that I would go to university to study Arabic, and then that I would live in Egypt and at some point discover Islam and find myself becoming a Muslim as naturally as I had been a Catholic before. And so it's a long process which is not over, but at some point you realize that somebody was always with you on the way, pushing you in that direction, and you thank him with a capital H, and you start implementing what you have to do, because it comes with duties, not only towards the community where you belong, but also towards the rest of mankind. And so I think that indeed I was blessed by the Lord to become a Muslim. And for me, things developed very, very naturally. I still don't understand why, in some way, I was elected like that or chosen to go that path, whereas others can follow other paths.
Speaking of a path you've chosen, not only did you become Muslim, but you've been able to become the premier scholar on Avicenna, who was a very, very important Sunni Persian philosopher in the 11th century. Now, why was it you gravitated towards him, rediscovering texts that had been lost for centuries, translating his work? Why was it Avicenna, and why do you think he is relevant 1,000 years after his death?
Again, one is not alone in this world, and I had the chance to have good professors at university. One of them was Simon van Riet, who was a world specialist of the Avicenna Latinus, which is the Avicennan text in Latin, the translations of his main work of philosophy. She was editing the Latin translation, and she said, you should look at that Avicenna because he is very intelligent. And so I did my Ph.D. about him. I was also lucky because I knew Father Anawati, who was a Dominican living in Cairo and who was also a specialist of Avicenna. And so with the help of those two great teachers, I was able to produce my dissertation. And it is while I was in Bursa in Turkey looking for some text of Avicenna that I was interested in, that all of a sudden I discovered that manuscript that had been neglected by scholarship for centuries. It was total luck. Total luck. The manuscript was very difficult to decipher because, Arabic, the letters are just distinguished by dots, and there was almost no dot. So N could be a B or could be a Y. It's only the dots that make the difference between those letters. And so it was a great game. It was really enjoyable. It was very, very demanding in terms of scholarship, but with the help of a few friends as well. Finally, I was able to produce that edition and a translation. And Avicenna is one of the greatest. You cannot understand the philosophical renaissance in Paris during the 13th century, the rediscovery of Greek ancient philosophy, but through Avicenna. It is when Avicenna is translated from Arabic into Latin in Toledo, Spain, during the 12th century, that then philosophical studies start again in the West. And so it shows us that we do not deal there with an exotic thinker. No. And that Arabic philosophy or Islamic philosophy is part of the development of philosophy in the West, a West that goes as far as to include Iran. And the Arabs, the Muslims, had borrowed knowledge from Greek sources, then they developed it, and they played their role in transmitting this new knowledge or ancient knowledge that they had renewed to the Latin West. And so later philosophers like Spinoza or even modern philosophers are all in some way indebted to Avicenna. That's for the West. As for the Muslim world, is still fundamental. If you go to a Turkish mosque, you will hear believers in their invocations calling God the one who turns the heart upside down, which is a traditional way of invoking him. But you will also hear them speaking of God as Wajib al-Wujud Hazret Leri, which means the necessary existent. To speak of God as the one whose existence is necessary, you don't find that in the Quran, you don't find that in the tradition of the Prophet. That comes from Avicenna. And so he became so famous, so popular, that some of his most fundamental philosophical doctrines became used at the level of popular piety in mosques in Turkey until today.
What is so great is to read this review, A New Standard for Avicenna Studies, written in 2002, reminding us that here the effort of Yahya Michot stands almost unparalleled. The investigation of the historical context, broadly apprehended, in which Avicenna lived and worked, is certainly fraught with dangers. And then you explain in your work just the significance of someone who is not dated at all, but rather, as you said, is the seed for so much of what becomes Western philosophy.
Yeah.
So thank you for having opened for us such great, great avenues of learning between our traditions, as you might say. Now there's another person whom you've spent, I guess, an equal amount of energy on, time on, and it's Ibn Taymiyyah. Yeah. And what you've done with this Syrian theologian is almost give what is in this review the alternative understanding to what everyone else understands. Mm-hmm. And that seems exciting to me, that you could almost, as I say, turn on its head the understanding of this figure. He wrote this, Muslims Under Non-Muslim Rule. Tell us about that book.
Ibn Taymiyyah he dies in Damascus, in jail in 1328. And he has been misused during the 20th century by some of the most extremist Islamists. is quoted, for example, in the 9/11 Commission official report as being the ancestor, the spiritual ancestor of Osama bin Laden. So to work about him is also to go a little bit into a minefield. But then when you read him, you realize that those who have misused him for terrorist purposes only read texts that he wrote to call for the resistance of Syria against the invasion of the Mongols at the end of the 13th century. But they start using those texts that were texts of national resistance against an invader. They use those texts to call for the killing of unjust Muslim rulers. And so if you go to other texts written by Ibn Taymiyyah, you realize that he was the most loyal subject of the Mamluk sultans under whose authority he was living, and who were not better than the Mongols. And you realize that he is caricatured, is reduced to just a few pages that he wrote against an enemy. And when you look at other texts, which is quite easy because you can access them on internet or on CD-ROMs, or most of his writings have been published, you realize that you have there somebody who is at the same time probably the greatest later Muslim theologian, and somebody who has a very, very moderate approach to the religion. He is a mufti, which means a religious scholar who has to give opinions about everything, every aspect of the religion, every problem arising in society. And so because of his role in society, he is obliged to develop a very supple understanding of the religion. And he is a pragmatist. You could even say that he is a relativist in some way, because what is good in those circumstances becomes bad in other circumstances. And religion has got to be understood in a way that will lead to the most efficient service to mankind. Injustice has to be fought, yes. But that's what you read in the Gospels as well, when you remember what happened to the traders of the temple. And injustice, of course, is not acceptable, no more by Muslims than by Christians, and vice versa, or other religions. But he says that there are cases where we have to be able to accept a lesser evil in order to attack a greater evil. And he says, for example, intelligence is not doesn't consist in being able to distinguish good from bad. Intelligence consists in being able to see the best of two goods and the worst of two evils. Wow. And so we have somebody who is far more moderate, far more intelligent, far more acquaintance with the everyday life of the society in which he lives than what people say about him usually.
Well, then I want to thank you again on behalf of all the people that have benefited from your resurrection of the writing strength of Ibn Tamiyyah, so that he would be better understood in his greatness and not be disparaged for some occasional writing.
Thank you.
We have to take a break at this moment, so don't go anywhere. We'll be back in 1 minute to continue our talk with Dr. Michaud. Stay tuned.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Welcome back to my continuing conversation with Dr. Yahya Michot our visiting professor from Hartford Seminary, who's here for the Interfaith Scholar Weekend that we hold each year in February, serving the San Joaquin Valley. Dr. Michaud, it seems that you're immensely a scholar, but also very committed as a person in interfaith dialogue and relations. So it's not just academic, it's personal and it's real. Can you tell us how you blend those two things of intense scholarship and activism in honor of interfaith dialogue?
In Islam, we consider that there is nothing worse than a useless science, and that if we know a little bit, that little bit which we know must be useful to others around us. And so I don't see any kind of contradiction between my academic work and some involvement in community affairs or interfaith work, especially in our time where I see so many misunderstandings leading to a lot of suffering among Muslims, among Christians, among other people on this planet. And so for me, interfaith work is part of what I try to do as an academic. If I'm able, for example, to show that somebody like Ibn Taymiyyah should be rediscovered, because if he is misused by people we cannot agree with, how do we deal with this problem? You can, if we want to use a metaphor, you can say that terrorism is a cancer. I don't consider that the antidote to cancer is diabetes. And some forms of Islamic hyper-spirituality that we see developing around are for me some kind of spiritual diabetes. If we want to deal with a spiritual cancer, we have to open a few abscesses. We have to go into the minefield, and we have to show that there are other understandings of the religion, of this author and of other authors than what we hear about. And so interfaith work is part of that, because there are so many things that are said about Muslims, that are said about Christians, that have absolutely no academic value. Just an example, if you allow me. We hear very often, oh, those Muslims want to impose their law on the rest of the world. Two things I will answer. First, Sharia doesn't mean law. Sharia means path. When the early Muslims want to speak of law, as they didn't have the vocabulary in Arabic, they imported it from Greek. Nomos became namus, qanun became qanun. As for Sharia, it means a path, it means a way. And so it introduces us to an understanding of the religion which is very, very different. And a second answer would be that it is not true that Muslims want to impose their religion on the rest of the planet, because the Quran itself tells us that if God had wanted us to be one single community, he would have done so. But he created us as different tribes, as different peoples. There are things about which we are not going to agree. He will hopefully tell us about them in the hereafter. But as far as we are concerned, there's work for everybody.
You know, it's interesting that that's actually one surah that I actually know where to find it. That's 548, and it makes that point so well that we need to remind people that in the best writings of all the scriptures of the religions, there's going to be something that is going to be eye-opening to another faith. So to hear it in the Quran, it says, "We have prescribed a law and an open way. If Allah had so willed, he would have made you a single people, but his plan is to test you in what he has given you, so strive as in a race in all virtues," which is what you said, but it's also right here in the Quran, which reminds us how little we know of other people's scriptures. Now, one thing that I wonder if you'll crack open for me now, the biggest challenge you see, Doctor, facing contemporary Islam and contemporary Christianity. beginning with Islam, the biggest hurdle, obstacle, challenge it has?
It is not to get reformed, as some people say, oh, Muslims should go through some kind of reformation. No, it is to rediscover in its rich spectrum of potentialities, intellectual, spiritual potentialities, the great tradition of Islam. The problem with traditionalists is not that they are traditionalists. It is that they do not know their tradition in its broadness. And so the more tradition we have, the better we will all feel. Because then we will realize that there are so many different understandings of the way we are invited to follow. You know, on a way you can go at different paces. You can follow different leaders. And by leaders, I mean those who lead the spiritual caravan of the followers of that way. And though there will be a role to be played by theologians, there will be a role to be played by mystical masters, because the way is wide enough to accommodate all those different spiritual itineraries. It doesn't mean it will accommodate everything, but it means that there is diversity. It is part of the way Islam is understood. As for Christian-Muslim relations, I think that one of the great hurdles today is that some consider that in order to purify Islam from those terrorist developments that we all condemn and that took place during the last few years, we should just import into Islam methodologies, exegetic methodologies and others that have been developed within Christianity. No, it doesn't work that way. And it would lead to more problems than solutions. I think we need to have respect, religious respect for our divergences. And we have also to sit around the table to make sure that we reach ways of cooperating, of competing in good deeds about all the other problems that we will be asked about. For me, as I said in the Fresno B, the article that you were referring to, when the Titanic is sinking, it's too late for the members of the orchestra to discuss about the music they want to play. What kind of planet are we going to leave to our children? There is, for me, an enormous problem where Muslims, Christians, and others can sit around the table, must sit around the table and act. That is one of our great responsibilities. We will never agree about some theological questions. Who cares? But if we do not agree about ways to save the planet, to reduce poverty, hunger, and injustice on this planet, then we are all doomed.
One question that I really have to ask, in 2006, the Pope gave a very memorable presentation at the university in Regensburg. I wonder what your reaction was maybe at the time, and also over these years, where you have seen Catholic-Islamic relations going, partly on the continent where you were, but then in the whole world. Where do you see Catholic-Islamic dialogue progressing under the new Pope?
I think that many Catholics, just as Muslims, saw some of the statements in Regensburg as very unfortunate. But we can see what came after that. Among other things, this fantastic development, love your neighbor.
Yes, the encyclical, yep.
And we have seen, in fact, because of this unfortunate statement in Regensburg, we have seen developments of direct dialogue between the highest levels of Catholic authorities and Muslim scholars, but also at the grassroots levels. We have seen initiatives among neighbors trying to build bridges between Muslims and Christians. So for me, Regensburg was important, not because of what was said there, but because of what followed it, and it's positive.
We only have about a minute or two, but maybe can you give me in a capsule the main presentation you gave on monotheism and prophethood, the meaning of a creed. In about a minute, can you summarize that?
It's quite easy to be summarized. If we want to know what God is, who God is, it's not enough to speak of him as a creator. Creation is an opportunity for revelation, which means that the God we love, the God we fear, the God we trust is not just the creator, he's the one who sends prophets to guide us and who invite us to follow a way which is the way of all the prophets from Adam through Abraham, Jesus to Muhammad, the last one. And so it's only when we speak of prophethood that we can really speak of the essence of the real being of God. Unbelievers are in some way ready to recognize God as a creator, but religion starts when you accept prophethood. And that's what I try to demonstrate.
I want to thank Dr. Michaud for being here today this week with us. I want to invite you all to join us again next week when we'll be visiting not only with Dr. Michaud, but one of his students, who is also one of our great leaders here of the Islamic community here in Fresno at the Islamic Cultural Center. That's Kamal Abu Shamsiya. Thank you, Doctor, and I want you to know that the Catholic Church is so grateful for the dialogue that we have been able to maintain with Islam, especially through people like the Islamic Cultural Center of Fresno. And thank you for coming here from Connecticut to share with us your insights, your study, and your commitment to scholarship and interfaith dialogue. Please join us next week at the same time.